We'll get started now, and just so people can join us, they come in late, we can have them join in, but just so everyone else, since you're here, we'll get rolling. The first thing I thought we would do, just because we are a small group, makes sense to introduce each other, say hello, tell us where you're from. I'm Amy Parison. I work for the New Hampshire Lodging and Restaurant Association. I focus really on our education foundation, so education and workforce. And I'll let Andrea introduce herself last, and she's our presenter. So then Mary Beth, I think you have a couple people in the room, so if you would like to introduce yourselves.
Yes, hello. This is Mary Beth and Jessica. We're from Revolution Tap Room and Grill in Rochester, New Hampshire.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, Alyssa. Well, maybe we lost Alyssa. Maybe she's there, but stepped away. All right, Linda.
Linda Palmer from the Dupree Service Company. I work in HR, so just always interested in knowing about what other companies are doing in this tough recruiting market.
Wonderful, great. And we had Christina from Appalachian Mountain Club, but then she disappeared, so hopefully she comes back. And then Alyssa, are you back there? You hiding behind your screen, or maybe you're not in your office? Okay, well, Alyssa's here too. Since we are a small group, instead of doing we can certainly use the Q&A in the chat to ask questions, but since we're a small group, I figured we certainly could just do it verbally and just communicate and share and all that good stuff while we have Andrea here. Just ask that you're on mute if you're not speaking, just to keep away from background noises and phones ringing in the background and things like that. So I will pass it over to Andrea to introduce herself and get us rolling.
Good morning. So thank you for being here today, and I'm thrilled to be here for the association. My name is Andrea Chatfield. I'm an attorney in Manchester, New Hampshire, with the law firm of Sheehan Finney, Bass and Green. I've been doing employment law for a long time. I'm going to leave it at that. But usually from the management side, I work with a lot of HR professionals. And in fact, I am also the legislative director for the HR State Council, which is the SHRM statewide affiliate. And also a member of Manchester Area HR Association, MARA. So very involved with the HR community for many years, and I'm happy to be here and talking about recruiting and screening and hiring, as well as onboarding. So I think we have about an hour today, maybe a little bit more, and that's fine. I've done a lot of presentations, so I'm very comfortable taking questions as we go. If there's something I say that didn't make sense, or you want to question a little further, absolutely. Either I think there's like a little raised hand icon, or put something in the Q&A, and Amy can help monitor that for us. So with that, I'm going to now attempt to share my screen. Always a scary proposition, I hate to tell you, but hopefully this will work. And please let me know if you can see my screen. Or Amy saying yes, so that's great.
Yeah.
So yes, so here we go. I'm going to just get right into it. What I'm going to eventually, with this presentation, we'll give you 7 tips on recruitment and screening and hiring. I should say seven areas, seven ways to kind of avoid the potential legal pitfalls. I know that hiring is a challenge for everybody. I heard somebody say something about we're always looking to see what other people are doing, and I completely understand, and I completely get that. And it's important that we get the candidate we want. I find that where it's been such a challenge to find people, I don't know where everybody went. I mean, everyone's always got so many open positions, and I just don't know where all the candidates have gone. But sometimes we hire the candidate we don't think is the best, but is the best of the crop we have, and it doesn't work out. And that's just as time consuming and labor intensive as not having a person, I think, sometimes. But at the same time, we have to avoid a lot of potential pitfalls or legal or potential issues. And part of that is because when you're doing an interview, you sometimes may say something in trying to be conversational or trying to be, in a relaxed, casual place to give somebody feel comfortable. And sometimes we say something or we joke that somebody didn't get, or they take something out of context. And we live in a society nowadays where any comment taken out of context can probably, it's sometimes, especially if it's on social media, it could probably torpedo your career. So it's a question of always trying to help train yourself, train your hiring managers on the appropriate things to say. And so I'm going to help you, walk you through the things you can't say and the things you can say. Again, avoiding the legal pitfalls, but getting the candidate you want to get. And I think what's important is that in addition to understanding that the approach here, I think sometimes people who are doing the hiring have this mistaken impression that their interview process, especially if they've got like back-to-back interviews with different candidates, they think it's speed dating. And it's not. This is not speed dating. Okay. Speed dating is you're talking about yourself, you're making yourself look great, you're like really fast, you're going to tell some jokes. But a job interview should never be approached as speed dating. It can be conversational, but it's a conversation that focuses on the job, not necessarily the actual person. And you're going to be doing a lot of listening as well as talking. A lot of times what I found, I've been on the hiring committee in one of the law firms I used to work for. And I always found like I'd be doing the job interview with another one of my colleagues, and we'd be interviewing a candidate. And invariably I'd find my colleague, who's an attorney, would be talking about the firm and talking about, what the firm does and how great a firm it is. And that's important, but it never really gave us time to understand the candidate and listen to what the candidate was telling us. So I always say it's about as much as about listening as it is talking and conveying information. But we also want to make sure that we avoid any comments that if the candidate doesn't get the job later on, thinks, wait a minute, maybe it was because I mentioned I had a disability, or maybe it was because I mentioned about my religious practice or something. So it's important that we learn to not say stuff that can be grounds for discrimination. And I want to give you a really good real life, close to home example. I think this particular case is a great lesson to be learned about how saying the wrong thing can be so costly. So there's Party City stores all over the place. Well, back a few years ago, there was a Party City in New Hampshire that had rejected an applicant. She was a young woman who had autism and severe anxiety. And she was working with Easter Seals, who was providing her with a job coach. And she had job shadowed and she had been some interviews. So she went to an interview. Party City was looking for sales associates, and she went with her job coach. And at first, the hiring manager thought that the job coach might have been the woman's mother and was, engaging. But then when she realized that, no, this is a job coach because this woman has a disability, they said that the hiring manager completely changed her manner and her attitude and started making comments about, well, we've had people with job coaches and it didn't go well. And also then tried to cut the interview short. She didn't want to hear about the candidate's experience shadowing other jobs. She didn't want to hear about, the fact what would be the role of the job coach. She just wanted to cut it short. She said to the job coach in a very patronizing tone, well, thank you for bringing her today, and something like that. So it did not go well. But then she said something that I think was even worse. There was another manager who had encouraged this candidate to apply for the position. And the hiring manager in the interview said, oh, that person, oh, well, she'd hire an aunt. She'd hire anybody. So it was pretty demeaning. And she had no interest in learning about the person's interests. Well, the candidate didn't get the job. She sued for discrimination based on disability. The EEOC took her case and sued Party City. And then they entered into a settlement whereby Party City agreed to pay $155,000. And also agreed to what was called, like, it's a 3-year plan where they had to revamp their reasonable accommodation policy. They had to train their HR staff on the policy. They had to just make sure that their employees knew about the policy. And they had to report to the EEOC over the next 3 years, anytime they denied a person a job who had a disability and a job coach. So the EEOC takes this very seriously, and that's how stuff said in an job interview can really get you into trouble. Then I wanted to mention that in how would that situation have been avoided? Well, one first thing is train. You're going to hear that from me a lot. If you have people in your organization who are doing the hiring, the vetting of candidates and the interviews, really important to give them training, give them some training on the best way to do that. And remember that we want to keep away from asking about protected statuses or discussing those statuses. And we also want to make sure that they understand that if somebody brings up an issue with a disability, that there's ways to handle that. You don't want to ask about disabilities, because just asking about a disability, if a candidate has a disability, is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the federal law. So you want to basically say, well, thank you for telling me that information. I'm going to, we're going to put that aside and talk about the job requirements, and tell me how how you're able to do the job. So you turn it around to talk about the job that the person is applying for. One thing some of you might say to you is, well, it's illegal to ask my age, right, on an interview. And it's not necessarily illegal to ask somebody their age, but it could be illegal what you do with the information. So I always say, questions about age really should be avoided, because it would then give you information that if the person you don't give the person that job, that they could then try to claim, well, it's because you knew my age. On the other hand, if you ask somebody specifically about if they have any disabilities or medical conditions that would prevent them from doing the job, while you think that's a pretty job-related question, that type of question is per se illegal, because the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits employers from asking at what we call the pre-offer stage of hiring anything to do that might elicit information about a disability. So we'll hear more about that later, but I just kind of want to give you a little flavor for that. So the other thing is that to remember is that in the end, in these cases, if you are challenged because you denied somebody a job, the employer is the one with the burden of proof to show that the questions they asked and the information they acted upon was all job related and non-discriminatory. So the first question, the first step in this process of doing better hiring is called designing a process. And the process having a process is so important. What are the elements of that process? Make sure you have something that is established and followed, rather than a haphazard, oh, we interviewed this person, we didn't interview that person, but even though they were qualified, we knew who we wanted. If you have a process and you stray from it, or you don't have a process and everything's very ad hoc, which sometimes I understand it could happen because you need to hire, sometimes you have a lot of positions to fill, and or you have certain key positions you need filled and you need them filled fast. Still, it's important to have that process, because we need to make sure we're properly vetting the candidate and being consistent, treating like people the same way. So it's a process that you want to have consistency. You want it to make sure it's all job related and that it's fair and reasonable, and that people who've applied, if they have qualifications, that they've given a fair opportunity. So then other features of this are, when we kind of dig a little deeper into that, well, postings, how and when do we post our jobs, right? Are they on a particular online board? Are they internally posted? How do we make sure we're doing, we have a good plan for that? How are we treating, how do we get applications in? Are they all electronic? Are they from a particular source? How are we getting them in? How are we treating them, maintaining them? and making sure that we're checking off. And then also screening. What are we looking for? Who does the screening of applications? How, what are they looking for? So that's an important part of the plan. And then develop a tracking. Do we have a process that we have the interview? Do we do a second round of interviews? Do we do a third round of interviews before an offer is made? Okay, the next step is about resumes. They're really good. People kind of, really focus on resumes a lot, and you probably, either some jobs you might get a lot, some jobs you may not get that many. But one thing I will say about resumes, they are good, but they don't tell the whole story. And that's why a lot of times you might find that in addition to the resume, not in place of, but in addition to a resume, it's helpful to have an employment application that the candidates fill out. Why? Because it gives you a lot of information in one spot, as far as contact information, reference information, questions about, certain things. They may not have certain parts of their contact information on their resume. I just think that sometimes the employment application can be a helpful supplement to a resume. So on resumes, what the important thing is here is that you need to really verify the information on the resumes. You certainly, a lot of times, if I'm doing a job interview, I have the job description and I have the resume, and I can ask a lot of questions about what they say on their resumes, their experience, and their qualifications or their education, whatever it is that the job requires, specialized training or certifications. Because one thing that I have found, and I question I always question what I see on the resume, because there was a survey done by Standout CV, which is a national organization, and they surveyed over 1,700 people over the age of 18. And what they found was that 55% of Americans admitted to having at least one time lied on a resume. Wow. And they even had it broken down by industry. And in the retail hospitality industry, it was 51% said that they had lied at least one time on their resume. So that really makes you want to question what they say in the resume. And I'm talking about, that's why, again, I like the employment application. They can fill that out and you can compare it to what they have on their resume. Did the dates match up? Is there gaps on the resume? Is the description of what they say they accomplished in a prior job kind of really match what the job is that they say they did? So there's a lot of times I really think you have to really peruse that resume and question the person about it in a very not adversarial way, but to try to dig a little deeper to verify that the information that they're telling you is correct. Now, I mentioned that I have in front of me when I do the interview, the resume, and I have the job description. Job descriptions are so important in this. It's part of that establishing a good, consistent process. Make sure you have a job description for the job that is being hired for, and make sure it's accurate. If you're working off a wrong description of the job, you're likely going to get the wrong type of candidate for the job. And I also think that it's also going to be the basis of the conversation, of the actual job interview with the candidate. In other words, what does the job say that you need? It's important to know that if you're ever challenged, because like with Party City, they had the employee that they rejected. Well, the courts or the EEOC looks at the job description and it might say, no prior experience required. So why would that not have made that applicant appropriate? Or maybe it does have certain things that are, that are in the job description about, working in fast-paced, high-stress environment, dealing with customer complaints. Those are questions that could have been presented to the applicant to say, all right, our job requires that this is a really fast-paced environment, that we have, we have to have somebody that takes in customer complaints. How do you see yourself handling those customer complaints, or something like that? That would have been a much more appropriate type of question for that applicant than what that hiring manager was focusing on. And then An accurate job description includes what the essential functions of the job are. And it highlights what the special requirements of the job are that make the job. That's again, really trying to match the right candidate with the right job. And you got to have a good job description for the hiring manager to really work off of. The fourth step is training your managers and your interviewers on how to do interviews. I'm sure there's plenty of like little videos out there. You could do vignettes. You could do a lot of little role playing in these types of situations so that managers get really comfortable understanding the mindset they need for a job interview, focusing on the job, focusing on the person, and understanding how that person can do the job and whether they can do the job. So when they're looking for the right candidate, you need to understand what you can ask and what you can't ask. So this is always a big piece of the hiring process. Well, what questions can I ask and what questions should I stay away from in job interviews? But we tried to put this presentation together so it's legal compliance and hopefully getting the right information from the candidates. So I'm going to go right to what those types of questions are. Age, the first, so we're going to kind of go through various different legally protected statuses, right? And federal and state law say that you have to make sure that you're not discriminating against applicants or employees based on certain legally protected statuses: race, religion, gender or sex, pregnancy, age, disability, veterans or military status. And then we also have in New Hampshire, marital status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Those are the biggies. So the first one I always like to talk about is age. In age, you don't want to ask a candidate how old they are. You don't want to ask their date of birth. And you don't want to ask when they graduated. So every time I'm looking at employment applications that employers may be using, if they always, you can certainly ask what, have you gone to high school? Did you complete high school? Did you go to college? What was your degree in college? Did you complete your degree? But you don't want to ask when they graduated, because it can be indicative. You can then find out their age through that. So we stay away from those types of questions. And as I said, one thing you can ask that is very age related is whether they're 18 or older, or whether they're 18 or older or under 18. Why is that important? Because from a legal standpoint, obviously, if you're under 18, and you want to hire somebody, you have to think about there's legal restrictions on certain types of jobs or duties they can do, especially if they're under 16. But then in New Hampshire, they have to have what we call working papers, right? And if they're anywhere, if they're under 16, they have to have a youth employment certificate from their school. If they're 16 or 17, they can have a parental consent. And what's nice in New Hampshire is that the New Hampshire Department of Labor on their website has those forms. So if you go to the New Hampshire, and sorry I didn't put a site to that, because it's actually kind of real difficult to find, but you go to New Hampshire Department of Labor and they have a drop-down menu on the left side. You go to forms, and under forms, you're going to go to wage and hour. And under wage and hour, you'll see the youth employment stuff. So that's something that I think is helpful. Use the state forms. And I always say, if the employee, the teenager comes in day one and does not have that paper, you cannot put them to work. It is a violation of law if they do not have that paperwork on file with you day one of when they're working for you. And plenty of employers have been caught having to pay civil money penalties because they didn't do that correctly. And the teenagers, I'm married to a high school teacher, and I know the teenagers are notorious for saying, oh, I forgot, I'll bring it tomorrow. Oh, I forgot, I'll bring it tomorrow. And then tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So if you got to draw the line in the sand with them the first day. Medical and disability questions. So as I mentioned, the Americans with Disabilities Act sets up a two-stage process in the hiring. Before you've made any offers of employment, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits employers from asking any questions related to mental or physical disabilities, or that could likely elicit information about disabilities. So no medical related questions at the pre-offer stage. That includes job interviews. That includes any pre-employment testing. You have to make sure that any pre-employment tests are not considered medical tests. You can certainly have somebody do personality tests. You could, assuming that they don't ask any medical questions or mental health questions. You can certainly have people do what I like to call physical agility tests. Like if your job is a demanding test, let's say it's, there's a lot of up and down stairs, there's a lot of climbing, there's a lot of lifting. You can have your job candidates demonstrate how they would do that job, how they would do the standard or typical types of tasks that are in the job. Provided two things. One, you're consistent. You have all your candidates do the same test. It's not like certain ones you pick out, but you have all the candidates do the test. And two, you're not measuring their biology. You're not measuring their physical, heartbeat rate or heart rate or blood pressure. No, you're just looking to see, can they do the actual functions of the job? So in the types of questions, though, that you want to be careful of that are not necessarily asking, do you have a disability? Things like, well, asking them their weight, asking them if they've been treated for any diseases, asking them, hey, are you in good health? Do you smoke or drink? And what you can't do, are there medical conditions you have that would prevent you from doing this job? Have you ever filed a workers' comp? Those types of questions you definitely don't want to ask them. So what can you ask? Because you may have physical demanding jobs. You may have jobs that have a high degree of stress and can really test people's, ability to deal with anxious or stressful situations. Well, again, it's all going back to the job description, right? Are you able to perform the essential functions of this job with or without accommodation? That's the legally acceptable question. Usually ask that on the employment application. And also, you can certainly say, you can, again, go back to the job description, describe that the job requires, lifting of 50 pounds or more. Can you lift 50 pounds? So those are the types of questions you can ask. Other things that you might be concerned about are issues about, well, does this person have medical conditions or chronic conditions that's going to cause them to be out of work a lot? I don't know about you, but we're seeing an awful lot of that lately. And so I think that, when you're talking about that, again, it's about you're telling them what the expectations and the requirements for the job are, and then asking them, can you meet them? So it's saying, if your company offers a maximum of 10 sick days a year, and in otherwise, we need people here, is that going to be, can you comply with that? One other thing I like to ask is, if you're, we have a lot of times lean staffing situations, you can talk about that to say, we're a relatively small organization, or on this shift, we only have 3 employees. So if somebody's out, it really affects our ability to be productive, or it affects the ability of the other 2 people to pick up the pace. So, if you join that shift, we need to know, can you comply, and are you capable of doing regular and reliable attendance? Sex or marital discrimination questions you want to avoid. Are you married? Do you have children? Are you pregnant, or what are your plans for having children? All questions that you really should not ask, because it can lead to potential discriminatory perception if you don't hire the person. And I know that we may have positions that have long hours, so you really are concerned if they have childcare responsibilities, or if they have children at home, or other family things they have to attend to. Rather than asking, well, what's your family situation like? What you want to stay, again, focus back on the job to say, this job requires you to, work. There are going to be times you're going to have to work into the evenings, times you're going to have to work on weekends. are you able to do that? Will you be available to work on weekends? Or if you're concerned that there might be a little nepotism going on, certainly you can ask if, if you're in this position, do you have any family members who would be that work for our company? You can ask that question as well. So those are some of the other types of questions you can ask to avoid those issues. National origin, well, when it comes to national origin or race, again, not asking, you can't ask what country they're from if they sound like they have a foreign accent. Don't ask where their parents were born. Don't ask if they're a citizen. If you do hire a person, then you will go through what's called the I-9 process, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And that's where you get information about legally that's where you get information about their employment authorization. But during the pre-offer stage, certainly no questions about their citizenship or nationality. Sometimes you might get the situation where an employee or a candidate will say to you that they're here on a temporary work visa, or maybe they've been here on a student visa and they would need sponsorship by you for a work visa. And they may say to you, would you provide that? I would say at that point, that's when you want to contact legal counsel to discuss the best way to respond to that. And whether or not you would sponsor a legal. You're not required to sponsor anybody for a work visa. That is a decision that is within the employer's discretion. But just know that that may be a question that comes up and you want to be careful on how you answer that. Oh, I love, sometimes you're talking to somebody and they have a really cool accent and you really want to know they're from. During the job interview process, it's important to train your managers not to ask, oh, where's that accent from? What a nice accent. Where is it from? Because again, it's going to elicit information about their national origin, and we want to stay away from those questions. You should not ask if English is your first language, but I think if your job would require, or maybe would be helpful in the job if the person was Spanish speaking or French speaking, depending upon the clientele that you're serving, you can certainly say, do you speak other languages? What other languages do you speak? Because at times we encounter, foreign speaking tourists or foreign speaking guests, and it would be helpful to know what languages you speak. That question is appropriate. Okay. Criminal records. So I think it's one thing that's important about criminal records is the impact. Having a policy that says you won't hire anybody who has a criminal record, that's a type of policy that is seen as having a very adverse or disparate impact on people of color or people with certain disabilities, because they tend to have difficulties in dealing with law enforcement. And we've seen that played out in tragic ways across the country. But so the EEOC has really developed a lot of guidance on this issue, that it can be it is discriminatory to have a blanket policy about not hiring anybody with a criminal record. But at the same time, you are going to have job positions that you want to be careful that you do have trustworthy people. I'm thinking about a hotel situation where you're going to have cleaning staff that are going to be going into guests' suites or guests' rooms when they're not there. You want to, again, make sure that you're not hiring a thief to work in those situations. And that's a little bit of a basic thing, but how do you get around that? So the questions that you want to stay away from are any questions that just say, have you ever been arrested? But what you can do is ask a person, have they ever been convicted of a crime that's not been annulled, or an arrest that's not been annulled by a court? And if yes, then they need to tell you about it. And then the EEOC has developed guidance about how to look at that and do a fact analysis to determine if that person would be a suitable candidate for the position or not. Because you look at the position, what it requires, you look at the nature of the crime, the timing, how long has it been since that person was convicted. And there's a whole host of factors you can go through, but I don't think it's something you want to discuss necessarily during job interviews. This type of question you can put on your job application, and then if it does, if the person does elicit that they have something, then you have that conversation. And I kind of think that sometimes you might have positions that you're going to do background checks on, that you're going to run a criminal background check, and you want to make sure that you tell the person, hey, this position requires a pre-employment criminal background check. Is there anything we should know? Or that you think will come up during the background check. And then you can have the discussion about to what extent is there is the conviction something that's very relevant? I mean, if it's conviction for, let's say, a drug possession that happened 7 years ago, and the job doesn't require, the person has had a clean record since then and has had a good employment record since then, and the job that you're having them do doesn't necessarily, involve having access to drugs or medications, then that conviction may not have much relevance to the job you're hiring them for, and it shouldn't disqualify them. Okay. Next one, religion. Questions about religion. Certainly we don't want to ask about religious backgrounds. We don't want to ask, you may have jobs that require people to work on Saturdays and Sundays, and it's perfectly okay to say this job requires that you work on Saturdays or Sundays. Can you do that? But what you don't want to say is, do you have any religious practices or beliefs that would prevent you from working on Saturdays or Sundays? Okay, and then some of the other things that you can ask them about, rather than saying what kinds of social clubs you belong to or the personal, you can certainly ask what professional organizations they belong to. And also you can ask again about what this work schedule is. Sometimes you might have certain uniform requirements that people have to wear, either for hygiene, for safety, and you might have some issues there. If an applicant says, well, I have certain religious practices that prevent me from wearing that type of uniform, then you can certainly engage in the conversation with the candidate about, well, what can you do? What type of accommodation would you need for that? Because you may have to provide some kind of reasonable accommodation. But again, you want to know what the facts are at that point and ask the person to just explain what it is they would need for an accommodation. There was, I think, a case involving Abercrombie and Fitch, maybe. They get in a lot of trouble with either age discrimination or religious discrimination because a woman wanted to wear her veil or her head covering, and they said that would not be allowed because the uniform look that they wanted for their sales associates would prevent that. And it was ruled that no, it would have been a reasonable accommodation to accommodate her religious practice to allow her to wear that head covering. Now, education, you think, well, that's not a legally protected status. Why is it important to know what you can and can't ask? And that goes back to what I mentioned before about asking about when they graduated. So again, you can ask questions about where they went to school, how many years they did in schooling, did they graduate or complete a diploma? I once had a situation where a company had either engineers or software engineers. They said, well, it's really important to us to know when they graduated, because if they graduated like in the 80s or 90s, they're not, that has nothing to do with the type of technology we're working with today. And I said, well, that's fair. I understand that. But the question is not when did you graduate? The question is, well, this job requires that we work on this version of this software or this generation of technology. What's your experience with that most up-to-date generation of technology? So again, you're asking, going back to what the job requires, asking what's your experience with this type of technology. as opposed to saying, trying to figure out when they got their degree. So, questions about wage. Well, in New Hampshire, you can ask a person how much did they earn in their last job. That's not an illegal question. It is becoming an illegal question in other states because of pay equity and pay gender issues. And there's a growing number of states that are pushing as a way to help close the gap, the gender gap on wages, to get away from basing a salary or wage on what the person has earned in the past, because women tend to earn less than men in jobs of similar duties and level. So the idea is to try to break that history by saying, okay, not asking about a person's salary history. You can certainly tell the person, this job that we're hiring for has a pay range of X to X. Is that acceptable to you? And that's fine. And if the person says, well, no, because I earned, or yes, it's fine, or no, because I was earning more, or I'd like to make more than I was earning before. And you can certainly at that point have the discussion, but about what they got in the past, but only because they raised it and they told you what it was. But, so it's not a illegal question to ask, but it's a best practice to stay away from what the person earned in their last job. Rather focus on, would the pay range you're offering be acceptable to them? And certainly not to ask, where does the spouse work, or where do they make how much money do they make? Because that should have nothing to do with this person's qualifications for your job. And social media, well, that's another one that has a quirky state law attached to it. State law in New Hampshire says employers are prohibited from requiring employees to give them their login credential information, requiring employees to accept them as Facebook friends or connecting on other social media sites. And so it's illegal to ask, in candidates, well, what's your username, what's your password? I don't think we'd ever have any reason to do so in a job interview, but it's good to know that you shouldn't be asking that. Asking them to accept our friend request, or, like us on your social media site. You want to stay away from that in any, job interviews. And even in the employment relationship, I can't tell you how many times people get in trouble because employees and supervisors are Facebook friends with their employees, and then they learn information that they'd rather not have known. But it can be a problem. So I'm not too worried about that one. Family, as I said, asking about plans to have children, getting pregnant, obviously can be discriminatory. We stay away from those. And again, it all goes back to job requirement. The job requires certain days of work, certain long hours, flexibility, work schedule flexibility. Is that something you can do? So other things that I think are good questions to tell your hiring managers, or even to sort of give your hiring manager suggestions on what they can ask. I always like the why have you chosen this field? Because I think that helps get the person talking about themselves, but in a job related way. What are your strengths? Describe your ideal job. And how soon could you start? Those are all fine questions. Oops. And then always is there anything else we need to know about your ability to perform this job? That's always a good catch-all question. And at this point, I'm going to stop and just say, is there any, because I feel like I'm flying through the stuff and rushing. I want to know if there are any questions at this point.
I've been monitoring the Q&A in the chat. Nothing there, but if anyone has any questions, just take yourself off mute and feel free to ask.
Okay.
Crickets.
All right. Now,
such a good presentation. There aren't any questions.
I hope so. I hope so. I just hope they just haven't wandered off somewhere.
We did lose a couple, but that's okay.
Okay. Fifth step is having a plan for testing. I don't know to what extent you folks do any pre-employment testing. So I will, certainly let me know if I'm going too fast or if I'm going too slow on this too, because you don't do any testing. But the types of tests I'm talking about are like aptitude skills tests, physical exams, drug tests. I don't know if any of you do drug tests, but making sure that if you're going to be implementing any of these pre-employment tests before you've made an offer of employment to anyone, that making sure you're doing it correctly. As I mentioned before, it's okay to have people demonstrate how they would do a job. That I think is something that you can do, provided you do that to all your candidates, and not just pick out ones that you think might have trouble because they look weak or they look small or because they are having trouble with something else, but that you're doing it for all the candidates of the job. Personality tests are okay. And a lot of employers, there are some that are really effective and employers like those, but make sure that those tests, you want to vet them and make sure that there's no mental health questions involved in there or other types of questions that might elicit medical information. And drug tests. I don't know if any of you do pre-employment drug testing. Excuse me. Testing for illegal drugs under the Americans with Disabilities Act is not is okay. Actually, it is okay to test for illegal drugs, because if somebody is using illegal drugs currently, they're not protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's not considered a prohibited medical test. However, one thing we are seeing is with the rise of people needing or people being able to use medical marijuana for certain disabilities, that it can be really tricky if you're going to be testing for marijuana use in a pre-employment drug test. A lot of employers have decided not to test for marijuana in any type of pre-employment drug test, but if you have certain jobs that require that testing, then you have to, because of federal laws, because they are commercial vehicle drivers, then certainly that is something that you have to follow. But drug tests, typically you wait until you have a final candidate, and that you can implement the test after you've made the offer of employment. Because after you've made an offer of employment, you can delve into information about any physical or mental disabilities or medical conditions that would prevent or would impair that person's ability to do the job, and whether they need reasonable accommodation at the post offer, after you've made the offer. So you condition the offer of employment on successful completion of a medical exam or physical exam, or successful passing of a drug test, or whatever else, like a criminal background check. And so you can make your offers of employment conditional upon that. And so one aspect of testing that I want to talk about and spend a couple of minutes talking about is artificial intelligence. More and more HR people are using AI-generated tools in their hiring process, whether it's to screen resumes, assess interviewees, especially if you're doing an online interview. AI is becoming a tool to use, but there are a lot of pitfalls with that. They're finding that AI can actually be a little discriminatory. And so the EEOC has published some guidances on the use of AI and how it can impact either civil rights law about non-discrimination on race or disability or gender or age. And in this slide, there are two guidances that I have here, and that these are live links. And one thing I wanted to ask Amy is, can you email the PowerPoint presentation to the people who attend after this?
Yes, they'll receive both the PowerPoint and the recording.
Great. So that in the PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on the links if you to see these guidances. I find them fascinating because it really shows that EEOC is trying to stay abreast of what is going on with AI. and how you can avoid legal entanglements because of it. The one regarding the ADA in particular, which is discrimination based on disability, is particularly interesting. And they have what's called promising practices in there, which I think are helpful to have. And the other thing that's interesting is that there is a new law in New York City that says if any employer is going to use an AI tool in their hiring process, they have to have that AI tool be vetted and determined if it's bias-free, and the employer has to put the report on their website to show that that AI tool is bias-free. Well, bias-free has to do with it's not going to have any biases on people based on their skin color or their age or their gender. But being bias-free does not necessarily mean that it could screen out people with disabilities. So that's why the EEOC's also developed these promising practices under the ADA to help with that situation. The important thing here, I think, is to remember is don't ever have AI be a substitute for the decision maker. Always have the decision maker be the human. The AI is the tool, but it is not the decision maker. They always want to have a human that can override an AI decision. I'll give you an example of how this can be very expensive. The EEOC sued a company called iTutor Group recently, and last month iTutor Group entered into a settlement agreement with the EEOC. The EEOC found that the iTutor Group, which basically hires tutors in this country to provide English tutoring lessons online to their clients, they had used this application software to help with the screening process of applicants. And the software was designed to basically screen out any females over the age of 55 and any males over the age of 60. So, I mean, talk about, okay, check off age discrimination, gender discrimination right there. And I guess they got caught red-handed doing this, and it was a deliberate change to the software. So they settled with the EEOC last month and agreed to pay $365,000 to a pool of, they had figured that it was over 200 candidates that had been screened out. So that 365,000 was going to be spread out amongst those people. And so they also had to enter into a 5-year settlement program with the EEOC to change their policies and to make sure that all their AI tools are bias-free. So that's how it can happen. AI cannot replace human judgment and cannot be used in trying to avoid the obligations of making sure your processes are non-discriminatory. So closing issues with the hiring process. So you finally have a candidate you feel is qualified, you want to offer them the position. That's great. But even in offering the position, there's a lot, I always say it's really important to make sure your offer is in writing. So oftentimes it's verbal. But, there's a few things. The New Hampshire law requires that you provide written notice to your employees of their rate of pay, of whatever fringe benefits they have. So it's important to make sure that you have that in writing. Offer letter serves a lot of purposes. It helps comply with that notice requirement. And it also states whatever conditions you have to the offer. And it also just really has a clear statement that employment is at will. Most times it is. And it will be a place where the individual signs that they say they received it. So in an offer letter, the typical things, what I have had a couple of clients, especially small companies, think that they have to do an employment agreement. This is not an employment agreement. This is an offer of employment. Terms and conditions can always be changed at the discretion of the employer with proper notice to the employee, but this is what the initial terms of that employment are. So it states, rate of pay, job title, if they're eligible for benefits, if anything, and that it's all subject to change. It's going to list conditions to the offer, that this offer can be rescinded if, or it's conditioned upon their signing an employee non-disclosure of confidential information agreement, a background check, the I-9 process, which I'll talk about in a minute. it's a place where, you know, you can list those conditions. If you're going to have somebody that's going to sign a non-compete or non-solicitation agreement, please discuss that with your in legal counsel first and foremost, to make sure that you're using an agreement form that's enforceable, and then how to present it. In New Hampshire, if you're going to require new employees to sign a non-compete or a non-solicitation agreement, you must give it to them in writing before they accept the offer of employment. So that's why I like to attach it to the offer letter, give it to them, so that when they return the offer letter to you signed, they also return the agreement, and you've shown that you gave it to them before they accepted the offer. Also, non-compete agreements with people who are called low wage earners in New Hampshire are unenforceable. And that is, the low wage earners are people who are making less than, it's either 3 or 4 times minimum wage rate. So it's not a lot of money, under $20 an hour. They are not, they should not be given non-compete agreements. If they would be unenforceable to low wage earners. So some of the onboarding things to think about, I'm going to talk a little bit about I-9s here. I think that's important because there's been some changes there. As I'm sure you all know, that every new employee has to complete the I-9 process. Well, Homeland Security recently issued a new updated form I-9. And as of November 1st, which starts next week, you need to make sure that you're using the new form. It will have an August 1st, 2023 edition date in the bottom left-hand corner. That's the one you use. The 8/1/23 edition will be mandatory as of November 1st. So make sure any hiring that you do after November 1st, you're using that form. They've now gone back to a 1-page form. It used to be 2 pages. They've gone back to a 1-page. So it does look different. And keep in mind that it must be completed and the candidate must present to you copies or their acceptable documents within their first 3 business days of work. You can do it anytime before they start work. But if they have not given you or shown you the proper documentation by the 3rd business day, you need to terminate them or need to send them home or suspend them until they can provide that documentation. Very similar to the youth employment. And if you are doing remote hiring, in other words, people that you're hiring, they're not going to you're hiring them. They're not necessarily going to work for you on site, but they're going to be working for you remotely, and you're hiring them remotely. There are now procedures that you can follow for completing the I-9 remotely. And I would urge you to go to the Homeland Security or USCIS website. I mean, if you just Google I-9, Form I-9 and, procedures, you'll get to the USCIS website, and they have all new procedures there for remote, how to do a remote I-9 verification process. One of the requirements is that you are using E-Verify, the E-Verify system. And if you're not using E-Verify system, you use their streamlined remote process. But if you have any questions about that, talk to an immigration attorney, talk to your employment law attorney to help you out with that, to make sure it's being done right. Make sure your I-9s are being done right. If you ever get audited by USCIS or Homeland Security or even Department of Labor, and you're not doing the paperwork just right on I-9s, it can lead to substantial fines. They build up for each I-9 that's incorrect. So that's why I say at the very, very least, make sure you're using the most up-to-date form starting November 1st, because if you're not, that's considered a paperwork violation if you're using an older form. Okay. Other things on the onboarding. So, you try to be welcoming, but it's really important to make sure that you get a lot of new hire form information. I find the emergency contact information is important, especially if you have remote employees. I've had several situations this year alone where a remote employee of one of my clients has just kind of like gone dark and radio silent, and the employer was having a lot of trouble getting in touch with them. and had to turn to that emergency contact form so that somebody could do a wellness check. Somebody could check on to say, is this employee okay? Are they all right? Make sure you get good information on emergency contacts. Remind employees to update it every so often. Get personal email addresses in case you have to communicate with them on their personal email instead of a work email. The Form I-9, the youth employment forms I spoke about earlier. Security awareness, so important. If you have specific security awareness, you know, how you lock down a place at night, what's password protected, what is, you know, restricted access in certain places. Make sure that there's a good presentation about that during the onboarding process. And then if you're giving them employer provided devices or property, make sure there's a list somewhere that lists what they're getting. Safety training, always important, should be highlighted during that onboarding process and periodically retrained on, but safety is a huge issue. And then make sure if you have an employee handbook that you go through it with them and point out the more important policies. Okay. So, you know, it's important that you take a lot of care in this process, but I think it's also so important to take care, not just to avoid the legal pitfalls, but in trying to get to the good candidates. So hopefully you've got some good tips here on how to do that. And again, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
All right, Revolution, you're the only ones left. Do you have any questions? Mary Beth and Jess. No questions.
Okay. Amy, I think it's 2:45 and there's nobody left but you and me.
I know. Oh, Mary Beth just popped off mute.
Hi, actually, do you have any questions like specific to the restaurant industry as far as like, oh, just things that we should or that we're able still to ask them in reference to? I mean, I understand the skill sets and, you know, whether they have certain qualifications for the particular job we're hiring for, whether they have experience with that. You know, a lot of the things that you mentioned obviously are, well, I would hope for the most part, for most people, are common sense.
Yeah.
And not to be invasive. However, in the restaurant industry, we do tend to get a lot of youth, and I would say youth and immigrant, especially for back of house.
Yeah. So with immigrants, certainly you can ask that question. Are you authorized to work in the US? And you know, they have to answer that question, yes or no. So that's going to be a big piece of that with the I-9 process.
And what kind of,
yep.
like as far as paperwork goes, are we looking for an alien nationalization card, or we're looking for a permanent alien resident card? Do we need a visa? Like, what paperwork are we looking for specifically?
Okay, so in the pre-employment phase, pre-offer phase, you're not looking for anything. You should not require that they produce anything other than being able to assure you that they have employment authorization. If you hire them, then you have to go through the I-9 process. And that is the Form I-9, which is the employment verification form that gets filled out by the employee and by you. And that process requires that they present to you documentation that verifies both their identity and their ability to work in the US. And with the Form I-9 is a page that says list of acceptable documents. You have a list A, list B, list C. They get to choose which documents to provide to you. If it's a list A document, you only need to see the list A document, like a US passport or a permanent resident card. Why only one from list A? Because it provides both verification of their identity, because it's got their picture and their name, and it's automatic employment authorization if they're a permanent resident or a US citizen. But if they provide you a document from list B, which might be a driver's license, a student ID, it just verifies their identity because it has their picture on it. you still need to know that they have employment authorization. That would be a List C document, such as a US birth certificate, certified copy, or a social security card that is unencumbered, meaning it does not say on it, it does not say not valid for employment authorization or that type of thing. So those are the types of documents. They might have certain visas. There is a great handbook that the government has on its website. So if you Google Form I-9 Employer Handbook and go to the USCIS website, there is a employer handbook called, what's it called? Bear with me for a second. I have it written down here. Too many numbers. Yeah, the M274 handbook. And it's been updated by the government, and it's a great resource guide for you, and it's searchable. So if you have somebody that presents you with something that looks a little funky, you can search for that term. The handbook gives you lots of examples of the types of appropriate documentation that you can accept under those
Okay.
lists.
Well, thank you for the qualification on that question. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And then you talked about types of questions you can ask specific to the restaurant business. I was thinking about that, and certainly what about sort of giving them scenarios, giving them like a question about like, how would you handle a customer who wants to send their food back, but it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with it? How would you handle that? And get them to talk about how they'd handle it. Or tell me about the worst customer you had if you have talking to somebody who's got restaurant experience, tell me about the worst customer you had. You talk about, we have a lot of families that come in here with a lot of kids. Can you handle, how would you handle kids that are banging on the table or making a mess, so you kind of give them real world scenarios that the job entails and ask them, how would you handle it?
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
I have 2 questions from the chat.
Oh, okay.
Can you ask a prospective employee who appears to have issues speaking English if they are comfortable communicating in English, if that's the predominant language used in your facility?
If you ask them if they're comfortable speaking in English, I would probably turn it around to get into the job and say to them, give them an example of maybe you have a facility where the employees, where the clients, need something right away, or are going to ask a certain type of question. And then say, how, they're going to be asking for a certain type of assistance, and how would that candidate respond to that client or that resident or something. But I think it is, when you've got someone who's having a lot of trouble in the interview to be understood, I think that is going to be an issue in the way you kind of document that is, and I've had that situation where it's like, we had trouble understanding them. How would an elderly patient be able to understand them? Is something that I think you can judge them on, but be careful about asking them those types of questions.
Okay. And the second question is, if you receive a no-match letter from the Social Security office, can that employee continue to work while the employer investigates if it's a mistake or there is actually an issue with the Social Security provided?
If you get a no match letter, then you do want to present it to the employee. You can give them a reasonable period of time to get it resolved. And provided they have given you proper documentation for the I-9 process, and it may include that in Social Security number, but you can give them a reasonable period of time, several days, a week, to get it resolved. And they are able to do so, then, you can give them a reasonable period of time, and you can continue to employ them. Excuse me. But if they, after a certain period of time, have not gotten it resolved, at that point, I think you want to confer with legal counsel as to whether or not it would be appropriate at that point, either to suspend them without pay or to terminate them.
That was all that was in the chat. Mary Beth, do you have any other questions? Okay. Then I would think, unless Andrea, unless you have like a wrap-up comment, I think we probably got to the end of our webinar. And like I said, I will share both the PowerPoint slides and the recording with everyone who attended as well as registered to attend. So even if they didn't make it, they'll still receive it. And we also will put this on our website for a future resource as well.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for presenting to our tiny little group.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate it, and a lot of good information and a lot of good information to be able to go back to in the future as well.
Great. You're welcome. Take care.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.